Hey everyone, welcome to our lecture on population and resources, particularly natural resources. So in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about changes in population and how that can impact population. There are several videos that are linked in this presentation that you have the links for on your Canvas course shell that you need to watch as well. They'll help fill in some of the blanks. All right, population and natural resources. So when we think through how we understand population, we talk about growth and limiting factors. And it's important to understand how these factors work. Ideally, a population is staying in balance with the ecological system that it exists in, because the amount of resources that are needed in order to maintain the population are based on the ecological systems you're in. So when we see growth factors in population, it's usually because of a couple significant three factors, right? So increase in available resources, fertility rates, and the longevity of the population. And we see this in lots of different populations. So if we have a really amazing year of rain, trees will produce more like acorns, nuts, and things like that, which means squirrel and mice will have more food, which means they'll be able to have bigger litters of offspring or multitudes of litters of offspring, which means that the hawks and the owls will have more food. And so their population will start to grow. But as we start to see a decline in that resource or an overuse in that resource, we see that population start to shrink. Fertility rates, how often you have offspring, is also going to be a major factor. How long it takes for those offspring to gestate. So if we're talking mice, they have a 4-week gestation period. If we're talking humans, it's 9 months. If we're talking like horses and cows, it's 11. I think elephants are like 22 months. They are pregnant for a very long time. So how many children you can have at any one time is a fertility rate. And also part of it is how long do those children live? How likely are they to age into the breeding age where they too can have more kids? So those play into fertility rates. So for instance, humans are pregnant for 9 months. It is possible that you can be pregnant, a woman could be pregnant every year during her entire fertile years, which, by the way, start around 13 or 14 and last into your 30s. And this is how we get some of these families that have 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 kids, right? Because that woman is fertile and having offspring often. And then, of course, how well those offspring actually make it into adulthood is another big factor around longevity. So if you're able to have, say, 16 kids, but only 6 of them are going to make it to adulthood, well, you might have had 16 kids, but how that impacted the actual population and how much that grew the population is very different than how many offspring you had. But if all 16 of those kids make it to adulthood and they each have 16 kids or 10 kids, right? We go from a mom and a dad to 16 offspring. Each of those are going to have, say, 10 offspring. We went from 2 to 16 to 160 within 3 generations. You can see how this is like a big population explosion. And this happens across all species. And then how long you live, well, humans live on average into their 70s. And I know we talk about the average age changing over the last couple hundred years, that our longevity is lasting longer. That's only because we got rid of childhood disease that took out, a third of children. If you think about all the communicable diseases that we don't have anymore, measles, mumps, chickenpox, polio, smallpox, rubella, all these diseases that used to kill a significant portion of children, scarlet fever, we don't have anymore, or we have treatments for it that allow you to make it through. So the odds of you reaching adulthood have increased. And so that big chunk of childhood mortality that we used to have has gone down, which has actually lengthened the overall expected age. Now we have a number of limiting factors, right? It's great if you have 16 kids, but if you can't feed them, they're not going to make it. And that's natural resources, right? So if you don't have enough resources to actually feed yourself or your offspring, your fertility rate is going to decline. Number of available mates. So how many, and this really depends upon the species again. If you think in terms of cows or horses or something like that, a single stud horse out in the wild may have a harem of 7 or 8 females he can impregnate. So you don't need as many males as you do females. But you have other species that mate for life where you need a 1-to-1 ratio. So it really depends upon how that species bonds and pairs with each other, how many mates are available. And then of course, predation and disease. So mice, they may have 6, 8, 10 pups when they give birth, but the odds of those pups surviving into adulthood and reproducing is small. Mice are basically prey animals, and so their ability to make it that long is reduced. And of course, disease is a huge factor. I just gave a bunch of examples in humans, but disease takes out lots and lots and lots of species. And then of course, the longevity of the species. So it falls into both places. So population change and resource use is important to this class because this is kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about how humans use and manage their natural resources. So healthy ecosystem is when populations are in balance across the trophic system, right? So you need to have your plant species in balance with the number of grazers and the number of species that need to use that as nesting places and as hiding places. And I mean, all these sorts of things are really important. So a healthy ecosystem is in balance, is when everything is in balance. And there are lots of examples of this. Humans tend to want to take out competition. So we tend to eliminate a lot of the top predators in an area, and that actually creates a huge imbalance in ecosystems. So when we decide that we're going to get rid of mountain lions and wolves and even coyotes, which are kind of a mid-level predator, your raptors, you know, we really impact the ecosystem because we're no longer in balance. Now, when we reintroduce them, some really fascinating things have happened. And there's the most amazing video, How Wolves Changed the Rivers. This is about the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone. So pause this video and go watch that because it's a really great video and it's in your Canvas course shell. Now, increased population decreases resource availability. You'd think that would kind of fall into the duh phase, but not as much as you think. Especially humans tend to have this idea that somehow resources are infinite, and they are not. We live on a finite planet. We have finite resources. And when we have a population that has outpaced the ability of renewable resources, and when we're stripping non-renewable resources out of the environment and ecosystem and changing that, that can have a real impact on the viability of a species. Now, the ebb and flow of populations within an ecosystem is actually pretty normal. So there's lots of examples of lower species in the trophic system actually having increases in population and then declining. So we do see this throughout ecosystems, this rise and fall according to what is and is not available. When a drought hits, we see declines in all kinds of populations because you have to have water to have life. No water, no life. So that's a big one we're starting to see, not just in mammals, but in all species, including plant species. We're starting to see declines in California because there's not enough water available for them. And so these species are actually shrinking in their populations. So what's behind human population growth? So a couple big ones in our history. The first is agriculture and animal domestication. So about 10,000 years ago, as glacial recession occurred and we had some climate shifts, mild climate shifts, not tons of carbon being pumped into the atmosphere, but some mild climate shifts. We did see the creation of agriculture and domestication in a multitude of hearths all over the planet. And when we talk about our agriculture lecture, we'll talk about some of that. And because we were able to start growing, having more control over our ecosystems through agriculture, we were able to produce more of the foods that we preferred, right? So that's what agriculture is. It's the production of food that we occurred on a larger scale. Now, there's this kind of mythos that ancient hunter-gatherers were just these passive creatures hoping that nature provided, but that is absolutely not true. Humans, for, I don't know, all of the existence of Homo sapiens sapien, as well as some of our ancestors, once we started having control of fire and we were able to have the ability to start manipulating our ecosystems in a very concerted way, we were able to give preference to plants that we wanted, but not in the same way that we did with agriculture. Because with agriculture, we transformed the landscape into what we wanted to use it for in a way we hadn't done in the past, which is why we think of agriculture as its own system. One of the things that agriculture did for us is that it shrunk the labor force we needed in order to produce food. So now we free up people to start doing things like being religious leaders and artists and scholars. And we see the rise of a unique religious leadership class. We see the rise of settled excuse me, of settled cities starting to develop and towns, and this very different way of living. So agriculture about 10,000 years ago is a huge shift in what human species does, and we do see a huge population change. The other thing that happens is the Industrial Revolution. And mechanization, it is another real shift in how humans exist and how humans' population was able to grow. We see the growth of cities and infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes really important because now we can ensure cleaner water, energy, transportation. With mechanization, the creation of the tractor, we free up even more of the population because tractors can handle a lot more agriculture. We see a shift in nutrition. Other huge one, sanitation. Sanitation is a giant boost to living, right? Not drinking the feces and urine and waste products of the town a quarter mile up the river really shifts how long you live. And then, of course, medicine. Modern medicine has also been a huge boon in our population growth. And you can see here, this is the 1700s. And you can see in billions how our population shifts. We will probably reach peak humans sometime around here. And that's around the 2050 to 2060. Our population shifting a little bit faster than this, but not by much, because we're seeing a decline in birth rates. And fertility trends are hugely important in understanding what's going on with the global population. Population predictions are very sensitive to future fertility assumptions. So how many people we actually have on the planet really depends upon how many children are being born. And most children actually make it to adulthood now, which is, when we look at that previous slide, right? Here's where we introduce penicillin and vaccines. This is where the polio vaccine kicks in. This is where measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, all of these childhood killers, they're introduced in this period. We go from 2 billion to 2.5 billion to 5 billion. This is modern medicine. This is vaccines. Vaccines are effective. We can see it because this is where it is. Look at the world population increase. So population predictions are very sensitive to future fertility assumptions. Remember, fertility assumptions are around not just how many kids you have, but how many kids you make it to adulthood. In the 1990s, fertility rates, the population would continue to grow, but we've actually seen a shift in fertility rates across the globe. There's no longer the idea that you have to have 5 or 6 or 7 kids so that 2 make it to adulthood. Thanks, modern medicine and sanitation. So we've seen a lot of this start to grow. Now, Hans Rosling did a lot of really amazing population videos. This is literally one, how we see shifts in population around economic development. The more developed a country, the lower the fertility rate. So when we think through like first world countries like the United States, countries in Europe, Australia, Japan, they have like fertility rates of less than replacement. So for a couple, you need 2 kids to make it to adulthood to replace you. But we are seeing fertility rates below that amount. So there's not as many babies being born in the United States to replace our population. Hint that this is why immigration is really important. And one of the issues we're facing in the United States today around our workforce, we've cut back on the number of immigrants that we've allowed into the United States. And this is now having economic ramifications because there's not as many people to take the jobs that are out there, especially at those lower wages. So this is kind of a one way to increase your population is through immigration. That's both internal immigration, as in moving around the United States, as well as having immigrants come to this country. And that was actually a really important way that we stabilized our economy in the past, was through immigration. What we do see is that we have dramatic declines, even in populations where we had very high fertility rates. So sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, Asia, Southwest Asia, Latin America, they're all coming down to the same level of developed countries. So they're actually coming down pretty quickly. And we're seeing this actually play out. This was one of the predictions that we had in the 1990s. And we're actually seeing this play out in terms of the number of children people are having. And that's where we get a term peak human. Now you can see this is from 2017, so it's about 5 years old. It shifted a little bit, but not a ton. You can see children born per woman. So here, like I said, this you need to be at 2 in order to have replacement level. You can see lots of places that are not at replacement level. Some places are even lower, right? These yellow areas are pretty low. Where we do see higher levels are here in Latin and South America, in Africa, here on the Indian continent. So this big behemoth is China. This is Mongolia. Over here in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, we're seeing some of that, although these have been going down as well. And this has to do with access to medicine, access to birth control, and the education of women. That's a huge driver in declining fertility rates. All right, just to give you a feel of how long did it take for fertility to fall from more than 6 kids to then fewer than 3. You can see some places it happened pretty gosh darn quick. A note on China, there was a one-child policy that was implemented by the government with pretty significant ramifications. So this shrinkage was not just because of modernization, access to better healthcare, the education of women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was an imposed policy. But you can see that the UK took almost 100 years. So did Poland, the United States, 82, Greece, 70. So here's European counterparts. What happened in these time periods? Medicine, sanitation, the development of industry, a number of major shifts that we see happen in this time period. Yes, we had vaccinations even back in the 1800s. Heck, George Washington vaccinated the army before their fight at Valley Forge. So we have them back in the 70s. They weren't that great, but they were at least inoculated. We can see a lot of countries taking about 20 to 30 years, particularly in the 80s and 90s, as these countries also gain access to modern technologies. This is kind of the post-war era, the post-World War II era, where these countries start to really modernize. So this kind of gives you a feel of what that looks like. So the reasons for the change, the number one reason for change is the empowerment of women. Women in the workforce, women being educated is the number one driver. When women have say in their lives and they have access to birth control, then we see serious shifts in birth rates. We see a much better balance of population with resources. And this also includes labor force participation. And then the second one is increasing well-being and status of children. So again, if you know that your child is going to make it, you don't feel the need to have more. And in countries where we actually put more resources into children, the likelihood of them making it to adulthood increases, which of course decreases the pressure to have more children. Shifts in economies and structural transformation in economies is also another huge part of this role. As people's economies become more stable, independent, and they shift from the need for agriculture, a lot of subsistence agriculture, into a more centralized agriculture, we see some of these shifts too. There's no longer a need for people to actually have those kids to work the lands. Hans also does a really great video here on religion and babies and how shifts in religious beliefs have actually helped shift population and fertility rates, and what that means long-term in terms of where the babies are being born. We also see a lot of culture and norm shifts. Some of that is driven by religion. A big chunk of that is driven by family planning and the ability of men and women and other genders to have control over their choices around when, where, and how they want to have children, or if they want to have children. There's even a growing number of individuals that are choosing not to have children. And so that's helping shift patterns of fertility as well. Fertility first falls and then rises with development. We do see some bumps as we see a decline, and then we see a slight increase, but then it tends to level off. And we saw that in a number of the charts. So one of the things that has happened is as we begin to have more access to resources, including through agriculture, and we have more people with free time because they're no longer concerned with the production of food, and we start to see industrialization, we start to see the rise of capitalistic consumption, the idea that stuff is representative of your status in society, we start to see an increase in the consumption of goods. And this is driven by a profit mentality, the idea that we always have to have growth in terms of profit margins. And there's a whole economic argument about whether or not that is a good thing, because it places additional demands on the consumption of resources, including non-renewable resources, which puts extra pressure on the global ecosystem. It's not working. Spoiler alert, it's not working out well. Like consumption is a little bit out of control. So right now, us in the US, it takes 5 Earths worth of resources to supply just the US in terms of what its resource use is. The UK is about 2.5. China is 2 and a smidge. India is less than half an Earth. Niger is about an Earth. We can't sustain this. We don't have this many Earths. We got one. That's it. We have one. This rate of consumption, particularly around the idea of disposable goods, is hugely problematic in terms of resource use. So not that just a couple generations ago, the idea that you would have single use almost anything was unthinkable. Of course, you reused everything, and you reused everything till it literally fell apart. We also manufactured goods to last. So there's been a shift in how we manufacture goods. We manufacture a lot more goods not to last as long, because that gets you to buy more, to increase profits. That's like economics 101, by the way. This is not some kind of big conspiratorial theory. This is like basic economics. So as we see more and more countries, communities start to stabilize in their population, we start to see the growth in their economies, they want to have what we have. They want to have an American lifestyle. One of the things America does very well is we sell the ideals of America. A McDonald's on every corner, 2 to 3 cars in every garage, this pretty high consumption rate. And other countries want that too. They see our movies, they see our TV shows, they are sold this idea that this is what having it made looks like. And they wanted that as well. And that's increasing consumption globally. Some of the worst industries are fashion. We have this idea of fast fashion, and that clothes just don't last as long. They wear out quick, or the idea that, you should only wear a set of clothes for a season. Yes, that's a thing. I know some of you are rolling your eyes at that, but lots of people change their clothes every season and buy new clothes every year. And that's increasing the amount of damage on the ecosystem for its production, but also as a waste product. Like, all that stuff goes somewhere. Most of it's going to giant landfills. A chunk of that is in those developing countries. So a little bit around, just to give you some feel about our footprint. So this is world population in billions. Carbon dioxide in parts per million. We are, by the way, this ends in 2010. We're at 420 something parts per million. So we're like up here now. Fresh water use is increasing, not in California, because we're running out of water, but in other places it is. You can see spikes in fertilizer consumption, marine fish capture, and tropical forest loss. These are all significant human footprints that are creating real issues for us. And that's because we have limits. All of our resources have limits. We have resource limits on our land use. So we're deforesting a lot of places in order to increase agricultural land. And we're finding out a lot of that land isn't good for agriculture. You can get a couple years crop rotation, but that soil just isn't meant to do what we're trying to force it to do, which is part of the reason why we're seeing increased uses in fertilizers, pesticides, insecticides, and fungicides, is because we're trying to force land to do things it was never meant to do. And this is leading to a lot of deforestation. That is also bad because forests are basically one of the lungs of the earth. They take in a lot of carbon dioxide. They help with temperature regulation. And when we cut down those forests, we see a drying out of the soil, a lack of water retention, a decline of overall water in the area, an increase in toxicity of the soil and the ecosystem, a loss of habitat for wildlife. And so this is having serious, significant impacts on that. If we keep going at the current rate, we will have deforested the planet, and we will be out of forests. Like we're going to run out of forests. Our forests are already in pretty dire straits in their ability to cope with climate change. And you can look at California for lots of examples of this, about how with it getting hotter and having less rain, our forests are much more vulnerable. We haven't kept fire on the land in a sustainable way. We've had fire suppression for over 100 years. So there's a lot of forest buildup that shouldn't have built up the way it has. And this is all coming to a head now. Is kind of catastrophic in many ways. Water. In the 1950s, people used half of the accessible water. Now we're kind of really dependent upon rain and dams and snow. Pollution loss has led to about 30% decline in our water. And we are actually, okay, depends globally, we are getting close to our limits in order to use water. And with a huge chunk of our water actually locked up in ice, that's very problematic as well, because that ice is actually melting into the ocean, so we're not able to access it. So another area is energy use. We are still mostly using petroleum, natural gas, and coal. These all come as non-renewable, limited resources. We are seeing some decline, especially in coal. Coal is kind of dying. There's still significant coal consumption, but as an industry, coal's been on the serious decline for quite a while. Natural gas has been replacing coal. I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing. And you can see here, we have other renewables starting to decline. Hydroelectric works great when you have water, not working so well here in California. We've seen a flattening of nuclear in the United States. We actually have closed a couple of our power plants. There's a lot of controversy around nuclear power. It is definitely non-renewable resource, but it can last a significant period of time. And if you have the right reactors, you can actually re-energize your nuclear fuel. But that's a whole other can of worms we'll talk about when we talk about energy. But most of our energy consumption is non-renewable. This is a choice, by the way. We could choose as a country to really throw down on renewable energy and pump as much money as we're pumping into our military budget or all of the tax offsets for extraction industries. We could put into renewable resources. We could create power microgrids on every home and use the sun and wind in most places, as well as really tap into geothermal to really transform how we engage in power consumption. We haven't, again, this is a choice that our leaders have made for us. It is possible to go a different direction. And you can see how we've seen a shift in how much reserves we have, how much production we've gone. We are still increasing, by the way, in terms of oil and gas production. So those non-renewable resources are still being used. How the planet is being affected. So humans have a huge ecological impact and footprint on our planet. I actually have a carbon footprint calculator on our course shell. I'd like you to figure out what your carbon footprint is. How much are you using? How many Earths do we need to sustain your lifestyle? You can see that there's a huge imbalance, by the way, into how much resource is being used depending upon where you are. For every person to live at US's footprints, we'd need 3, I've heard as many as 12 planet Earths. So it really depends upon how much consumption you're doing. And then, of course, this is changing as we're seeing shifts in population across the Earth, and how climate change is actually impacting access to resources. So like I've talked about here in California, we have a real water issue. We're also going to have a real energy issue as California keeps having higher and higher temperatures. More and more people are going to need access to cooler environments, whether we decide to do that through creating urban forests and more trees in communities, or we decide that people are going to need to get air conditioning, right? Like these are 2 different ways that we can create cooler environments. And depending upon which way we go is going to impact the environment as well. So basically our commons are in danger. The idea of the commons is supposed to be things that everybody should have equal access to and should kind of be a right for everyone to have as like basic stuff, right? Air, the right to non-polluted air and not hot air. Water pollution, we're seeing a lot of ground aquifers being declined as well as polluted, particularly through leakages from mining, both shaft mining as well as pit mining are having real issues on aquifers, as well as natural gas production is having impacts on people's aquifers. Of course, our oceans are in crisis. They're definitely at crisis level. We talk about our national parks, wildernesses, and wetland areas as part of our commons here in the United States. Everybody owns them. And their health is important as well. And of course, non-renewable resource depletion is part of the commons. And most importantly, biodiversity is in danger. When we talk about our resource choices and population and how as we increase our populations, we're seeing shifts in biodiversity to accommodate humans, that's also very problematic. We are in the anthropogenic extinction, the 6th mass extinction. It takes tens of millions of years, by the way, to recover. And given that humans haven't even been around for a million years, we've done quite a bit to our planet. But in the end, you know, Mother Earth is going to figure this out. It's humans that are in danger from our own choices. The upside is we are seeing a greater ecological ethic that is emerging, especially among the millennial and Gen Zs, but also among Gen Xers in order to make shifts. There's increasing pressure on leaders to engage in more clean energy and renewable energy resources. I mean, those still have a footprint. You still have to make solar panels and they have a shelf life and they have a point where they have to be changed out. I mean, it's not like there aren't impacts by these renewable resources, but it's certainly less over time than some of the other choices. And that more ethical, ecological ethic is really, and also ecological innovation is really what we need to be thinking about as our population grows in order to ensure stable biodiversity. All right, that is it for our lecture on population. I hope you have a great day.